If Jesus is coming back quickly, should Christians get married? Today we continue our conversation with Dr. Craig Keener on the Bible Backgrounds podcast. I'm Dr. Kurt Jaros, your host. Greetings in the Lord. Welcome to the Bible Backgrounds podcast with Dr. Craig Keener. Dr. Keener, last week we were looking at this notion of Jesus coming back quickly and what that meant, and you provided the answer that, well, it's about the imminence, that there's this sense of a coming quickly, not necessarily that it's going to happen in a short time frame. There are some scholars who do believe that the apostles believed Jesus would come back within their lifetime, and so I have some questions pertaining to that.
Before we go on, can I just say they probably did believe Jesus was coming back in their lifetime, and they had every right to believe that was at least likely. Mm-hmm. And even with people believing that an Antichrist is coming, I mean, what it speaks about the abomination of desolation and the things that were fulfilled in 70, they almost happened in the 40s, when one of the Roman emperors was getting ready to set up his image in the temple. But within the Gospels themselves, Jesus says he's going to come with his holy ones, and he says there's some of you here who are still going to be alive when he comes back in glory. And yet all three Gospels that report that are immediately followed by the Transfiguration. So it's clear what the Gospel writers thought, how that was fulfilled. So, and when Mark wrote, probably not all of the apostles had died yet. So it's, but still he's not deferring that part to the future. It's like the foretaste of that happened in the Transfiguration. So again, the phasing of things, you get the foretaste of it. And when he says, not all of you will have died, some of you will still be alive. The contrast is probably not with the other apostles, but in other words, it's just not with the other apostles having died, but just some of you will be the ones to see this, and not all of you will see it. So there were only 3 of them at the Transfiguration and so on. But anyway.
Right, so Jesus isn't talking about some time, decades in the past. It's referring to the Transfiguration. Yeah, that makes sense in the context. Okay, so my question is pertaining to Paul and Paul's advice about marriage. So if Paul believed that Jesus was coming back within his lifetime, it makes sense that you shouldn't get married and have kids. You should instead devote...
Are you married?
I am, yes.
Heretic. That's it. Yeah.
There he draws this distinction between the Lord's teaching and his own teaching. Some might say advice. What's your take on the language there and what Paul meant?
Well, actually, where he says, the Lord says, but I say, that's not referring to that particular thing. That's referring to his making an exception for divorce. Because Jesus said no divorce, gives a general principle. But Paul qualifies it in the case of, if the other person leaves, that's not something that's on you. You can't control that. And of course, in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9, we also have an exception for adultery. So, and I think an analogous exception today we would make for abuse. But all that to say, I don't think Paul is saying, well, this is for sure, and this is my guess, maybe. Because, I think it's around verse 40, he says, I think I also have the Spirit of God. If you want a case where Paul claims inspiration, that's about as close as you're going to get. But Paul is saying this is where we have a saying of Jesus. Jesus said this. And here, Jesus didn't say this, but here's what I say. Well, that's the same thing Jesus does when he says, you have heard it said, and quotes the Old Testament, and it says, but I say to you. Mm-hmm. It was a Jewish rabbinic way of saying, you've heard this is true, but also, and then you qualify or build on that, and I think that's what's going on there. Now, as for the idea of imminence, I think that's part of it. He gives some advice, and he doesn't actually, I think, say in light of the coming of Jesus so much as in the coming of tribulation, which is eschatological in its nature, that end time type in its nature. But there have been, for King James only Baptists, it might be helpful to notice that the early Baptists thought that they were in the Great Tribulation as they were being persecuted by King James. But that's just an aside. There have been eschatological type things, like when the temple was destroyed and under Nero's persecution, the fiery trial. Those were like foretastes of 1 John 2:18. You've heard that an Antichrist is coming. Even now there are many Antichrists. But getting back to the singleness thing, there are advantages of it for those who are built for that. But of course, not everybody's built for that, because just like it says in Genesis chapter 2, I think from verse 18, something like that, it's not good for a man to be alone. And we were, even in Genesis 1, we were designed to be able to procreate. So, we're biologically primed that way. So, Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 is doing still what he was doing in chapter 6. In chapter 6, verse 12, he says, everything is lawful for me, but not everything is good for me. And then in verse 13, he says how food is for the stomach is for food. But that doesn't mean that the body's for sex and sex is for the body. And then he says, some people say, who cares? God's going to do away with the body. But Paul goes on to remind them, he's going to raise the body someday. The body matters. So he keeps saying something and then qualifying it. In Romans, you have something like that where he'll say, you say, and then he'll refute it with an imaginary interlocutor. That was a common method of teaching back then. It's if you can't engage students because you're writing it down, you bring up a point and then you answer it, and it stays engaging that way. The difference in 1 Corinthians is he does, and this was also done in ancient literature, he cites the imaginary opponent or he cites other people's position and then responds to it, but he doesn't respond to it by saying, you say. He just, cites it and then responds to it. And so in chapter 7 and verse 1, Paul says, now concerning the things you wrote to me, and that now concerning in Greek is parade. Paul uses it to start new topics in 1 Corinthians. He does it a little bit in 1 Thessalonians also. So he's on this new topic, and the topic is, now concerning the things you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Apparently that's one of the things they brought up. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. But then he goes on in the next few verses to say, it's a little late to say that now that you're married. Well, you want to know why some of the people are out visiting prostitutes in chapter 6? Well, maybe partly because some of their spouses won't have sex with them. That's not an excuse, but it helps you understand maybe a little bit more what was going on
the context,
there.
Yeah.
So the wording that he uses in the next few verses is wording that had to do in the ancient world with having sex. Good for a man not to touch a woman. Touch was a euphemism for having sex. Mm-hmm. Or, not always, but it could be used that way, and in this context it clearly is. So it's good for a man not to touch a woman. You have a point, but now that you're married, let every husband have his wife, and vice versa. The husband doesn't have authority over his body, the wife does, and vice versa. Those were all euphemisms for intercourse. He talks about the duty. In the one reciprocal duty that you have in the ketubah, in the Jewish marriage contract and expectations, they both should be open to having intercourse. So again, that's not to say that's really grounds for divorce. Paul doesn't say it's grounds for divorce, but he does recommend that they do that. So, and then he says, now, yeah, it's good to be single, and to be totally devoted to the Lord, and not have to be distracted by marriage, oh, that's great. But not everybody's built for that. It's better to marry than to burn. And burn was commonly used throughout ancient literature, not, as some people say, on the basis of just a couple texts or a handful of texts, burn in hell. He's not talking about that. He's talking about burn with passion, burn with lust. It's all over the place in ancient literature, especially Greek literature. And actually, when you're figuring out why do they think it's better to not be married, there was a stream of philosophic thought that said you don't want to get married because that will be a distraction. But when your passions build up, just go out and have sex. Paul's definitely against that. There was a Jewish tradition, however, which Paul certainly knew, and that was that sexual passion can be distracting and marriage is a good outlet for it. There was one rabbi who was said to have accomplished so much, and they said, "How did you accomplish so much?" He said, "I got married at 16. So I controlled my passion." Again, this is not a recommendation. Please don't run out and just get married at 16 because I just quoted that rabbi. But anyway, all that to say, these thoughts are around, and Paul has the more Jewish view where, yeah, your passion can be a distraction. So can marriage be a distraction? Yeah, but so can your passion. And if your passion's going to be more of a distraction than marriage, get married. So he's not recommending universal sinfulness. He's definitely not recommending that. Not recommending universal singleness. He's saying some people are built for that, and hey, it's a gift from God, and celebrate if you have that gift. But if you don't have that gift, go ahead and get married. And he's presupposing a culture where people actually had that option. I mean, if you don't have that option, then you need to pray for the gift while or at least temporarily until you find a spouse. But yeah.
Related to this topic is the question of divorce and the grounds for divorce. You mentioned that phrase. Christians have a variety of perspectives on this.
Some are right, some are wrong.
I'd like to think so, yeah. Maybe you can address that. What is, when you survey the New Testament, what do you think it's teaching about cases for divorce? I know it's a tough question.
Well, it's not a tough question. It's just you're trying to get all this in one session. That's kind of, I'm trying to talk fast, but still. Jesus says, don't divorce. And it's a statement of principle. It's a general statement. Like in Proverbs, you have general statements that are sometimes qualified. Proverbs 26:4-5. Answer full according to their folly. Don't answer full according to their folly. Different settings. But it's a general principle, and it's qualified elsewhere in the New Testament. So, like I said in Matthew, it's qualified if the person's being sexually unfaithful. Paul qualifies it if there's abandonment of the spouse. I think people sometimes want to overqualify it. There actually was a debate among schools of Pharisees in Jesus' day, and this is probably one reason the question came up. The stricter school of Pharisees, the school of Shammai, this is in Mishnah Gittin 9. The stricter school of Pharisees, the Shemmites, said a man can divorce his wife if she's unfaithful to him. Now they define that not just as sexual immorality, but as, if the person tried to find somebody else but couldn't, like they went out in public with nude hair. Head coverings, that's a different topic. We won't be able to cover that this time. But and then the other school, the Hillelites, said a man can divorce his wife. They didn't make it both directions, but in the Greek and Roman world, it was both directions. A man can divorce his wife if she burns the toast. Now, they weren't recommending that he divorce his wife for that. They thought it was really tragic when divorce happened. But if she burns the toast, in other words, he can divorce his wife for whatever he wants, if there's some sort of offense. Well, is Jesus agreeing with the Hillelites and saying, any cause, you can do it, quoting Deuteronomy 24? Or is he agreeing with the Shemites? Well, he's closer to the Shemites. But some people, they latch on to where Jesus talks about anybody who remarries commits adultery. I see that as hyperbole, rhetorical overstatement to drive home the point, because even in the same context, Jesus says, whatever God has joined together, let no one put asunder. He's not saying it's ontologically impossible to put them asunder, and therefore if you remarry, well, you're still married to the same person, and therefore it's adultery. He's not saying that. He's saying not you can't, but don't. And that's also how it's taken. That's why we can have exceptions. Because if the innocent party, where there is an innocent party, if the innocent party, the one who doesn't break up the marriage, is allowed to remarry, because they're not still married to the guilty party, how can the guilty party still be married to the innocent party? So the very fact that you have exceptions means that it's not an ontological statement. It's a way of saying, like what you have in the context of it in Matthew 5:32, the radical solution, don't get divorced. The radical solution for that is, remarriage is adultery. So just before that, he says, if you're angry with somebody, it's equivalent to murder. If you look on a woman to lust after her, and of course the principle extends to looking on man or whatever, but and he says you've committed adultery in your heart. Well, what's the solution? He says, if your eye is causing you to stumble, rip it out. Now, most people I know have both eyeballs. Does this mean they've never lusted? Or do they take it as hyperbole, like getting a camel through the eye of a needle, or moving a mountain with your faith? I mean, those were standard hyperboles in Jewish thought. There's hyperbole throughout Jesus' teaching. It was a common Jewish teaching technique. And anybody who reads the Gospels very much is going to recognize that. So the point of it is not all remarriage is adultery, especially when you have the exception clauses. The point of it is, don't break up your marriage, and do your best to make your marriage flourish. But again, Paul in 1 Corinthians and what we have in Matthew, at the least, that much shows us that God doesn't hold you responsible for somebody else's choices.
What would you say to someone who's in a difficult marriage situation? For some people, we can talk about these intellectual things, but for some people, they're living it. They're struggling right now. And what would you say to people like that?
It kind of depends on. I don't think there's a one size fits all.
Sure.
So, exegetically, I can give you the principles, but in terms of pastoral counseling, it's like, okay, there's some cases that are clear cut. Then there are other cases that aren't. If the person is beating you, Jesus says, if they persecute you in one city, flee to another. That's if they're persecuting you in the name, because you're a follower of Jesus. So how much more if they're just persecuting you for? We have biblical grounds, I think, for getting away. That's Matthew 10:23. But we also have. Like one person asked me, my spouse won't talk to me. For a year, they've refused to have any physical contact. They've refused to talk to me. I just can't love them anymore. And so I'm getting myself in deep water here. So I'm just going to say, this is what I felt in this situation, I should say. Some people think this is too strict. Some people think it's too lenient. But what I felt led to say in that situation, it was the best I knew what to say, because I didn't have the other person there to hear their side or whatever. I said, if you can't love them for their sake, can you love them for Jesus' sake? And hang in there one more year and pray and see what God might do. And he said, for Jesus' sake, I'll do it.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah, it's not a. Yeah, it's not an easy situation in a difficult marriage, but in an unsafe marriage, just get out.
Mm. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your analysis of what the Scripture's teaching on singleness, divorce, remarriage even, all within 20 minutes here. There's so much more that could be said, of course, and this is just tip of the iceberg material.
I do have a book on divorce and remarriage. It was my first book. It's not the best one I've written. There's also a 3 Views book by Bill Heth and Gordon Wenham and myself. Gordon argues for the no remarriage. I argue for remarriage. And Bill basically used to hold Gordon's view, switched to close to my view, and so it's kind of 2 ganging up against 1. But anyway, it wasn't meant to be that way. But
those are easy 3 Views books then. Great. If you'd like to learn more about this subject or other subjects, or if you want to hear about Dr. Keener's journey, head on over to craigkeener.com. There are all sorts of great free available resources. They're free because Dr. Keener has a heart to make this available to as many people as possible. You can search his website there. Subscribe so you don't miss a single post from there. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to his YouTube channel, follow him on Facebook and Twitter, and if you're listening to this podcast on audio, please subscribe through Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or whatever app you may be using. This is the Bible Backgrounds Podcast with Dr. Craig Keener.